The part played by sea power during the Second World War was not radically different to that of 1914-18. Its prime role remained that of securing the oceans and denying them to opposing fleets, so that maritime communications could be maintained. Thus, navies were still built around battle fleets, and at the beginning of the war, the battleship remained their primary component. Britain's Royal Navy was, in 1939, still the largest in the world, but also the most far-flung, with bases all over the globe. As in 1914, it hoped to be able to draw the German Navy into battle and destroy it. Hitler wanted the German Navy to be strong enough to challenge the Royal Navy. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the naval commander-in-chief, was firmly convinced that the Navy could never match the British fleet on the surface because of the severe limitations placed on it after the Great War. Rather, it should concentrate on severing Britain's lifeline, her maritime trade. The German naval expansion program, Plan Z, therefore represented a compromise. Hitler was allowed his battleships, and the first of them, the Bismarck, was launched in February 1939. Her sister ship, Tirpitz, went down the slipway 2 months later. Raeder injected the concept of the pocket battleship, thinly protected, but heavily armed and capable of high speed in order to force the British to protect their convoys with battleships. War came too early for the completion of Plan Z, but German warships were a grave threat to British commerce. In late 1939, French and British naval task forces had to be used to hunt down the pocket battleship Graf Spee, which had been sinking merchant shipping in the Indian Ocean and South Atlantic. 3 British cruisers finally brought her to bay off the mouth of the River Plate and forced her scuttling. In May 1941, the Bismarck brought out the British home fleet in force and succeeded in sinking the battle cruiser Hood. Slowed by a torpedo strike from a carrier-borne aircraft, Bismarck was sunk by British battleships. The British home fleet's attention now gradually turned to German-occupied Norway, especially once the convoys to Russia had begun in the late autumn of 1941. In January 1942, the German battleship Tirpitz was deployed to Norway, where the numerous fjords gave her plenty of relatively safe anchorages. Other major German warships were also sent there. These included the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, who in February 1942 made an audacious dash up the English Channel from the French port of Brest, where the Royal Navy had them trapped. Britain's naval power and the RAF were unable to stop them reaching the Baltic, although both ships were damaged by mines. The threat of these vessels to the Russian convoys was to keep the home fleet on tenterhooks until almost the end of 1944, for it took all this time to destroy them. On the last day of 1942, the strong escort of Russian convoy WWII managed to prevent the German cruisers Hipper and Lützow from attacking it, an action which was named the Battle of the Barents Sea. So disillusioned was Hitler by this failure of his surface ships that he summoned Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the U-boat arm, to replace Raeder as commander-in-chief. While Dönitz had always believed that the U-boat was the best means of defeating Britain, he realized the value of maintaining the Norwegian threat in order to prevent the British home fleet from acting in other ways against Germany. The British home fleet continued to use the Russian convoys as bait. At the end of 1943, it succeeded in tempting out the Scharnhorst from her Norwegian anchorage. The British intercepted and sank her in what became known as the Battle of North Cape. But this still left the Tirpitz. In September 1943, British midget submarines, known as X-craft, had managed to get into her fjord and damage her with limpet mines, although all the X-craft were lost. In April 1944, carrier-borne aircraft launched an attack on her. They managed to damage Tirpitz, but again, not significantly. Finally, during the autumn of 1944, two of RAF Bomber Command's crack squadrons attacked her 3 times. On the 12th of November, they damaged her so severely that she capsized. Only now was the German surface threat at an end. In the Mediterranean, fleet versus fleet actions did take place. For a start, there was the Royal Navy's bombardment of the French fleet in its northwest African ports in July 1940 to prevent it falling into German hands. It was an act which caused great enmity in Vichy France against Britain. But in November 1942, the French scuttled their fleet in Toulon after the Germans occupied Vichy France. The main naval action in the Mediterranean, at least during the first half of the war, was between the British Mediterranean fleet and the Italian Navy, which was determined to make the Mediterranean its sea. It was a battle largely hinged on the British efforts to keep their isolated but crucial central Mediterranean foothold of Malta resupplied. The running battle resulted in a large loss of ships. Indeed, the British tactic was to use the Malta convoys to provoke the Italians into a major fleet action. Land-based Axis aircraft played a significant role in harassing British ships. But the two most significant naval actions revealed that it was the British aircraft carriers which were the key factor, the Italians having none of this type of vessel in commission. In November 1940, Swordfish from the carrier Illustrious made a daring attack on the Italian fleet base at Taranto. They severely damaged 3 battleships. Then in March 1941 came the biggest naval battle that the Royal Navy had fought since Jutland in 1916. The Mediterranean fleet managed to intercept the Italians attempting to attack convoys taking British forces to Greece. The British had 3 battleships, and their warships sank 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers. It was, however, aircraft, this time from the carrier Formidable, which struck the decisive blows, damaging the battleship Vittorio Veneto and crippling the cruiser Pola. The British victory at Cape Matapan ensured that the Italian fleet stayed in port for the next few months. Using human torpedoes, like this British chariot, Italian frogmen did, however, sink the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant with limpet mines in Alexandria Harbour in December 1941. But it was the Pacific which really demonstrated the primacy of the aircraft carrier, one that remains to this day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan for the surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was drawn directly from the British strike on the Italian fleet at Taranto. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself in December 1941 was a devastating blow, destroying much of the US Pacific Fleet. But the Japanese missed the 2 fleet carriers, Lexington and Enterprise, which were at sea at the time. It was around these 2 that the fleet was rebuilt. By the spring of 1942, the Americans were ready to confront the Japanese. The battles of the Coral Sea in May and Midway in June not only halted Japanese expansionism, but also regained a measure of control over the Southwest Pacific. These battles were fought entirely by carriers, with the opposing fleets never coming within gun range of each other. There was a distinct pattern to these actions. First, the opposing fleet had to be located, done either by reconnaissance aircraft or submarine. Then the first wave of aircraft was launched. Dive and torpedo bombers were the 2 types of carrier attack aircraft. Fighters like these Japanese Zeros gave protection to the attack planes. To give greater range, aircraft were often fitted with additional fuel tanks. Carriers were at their most vulnerable when their aircraft were on the flight deck, being rearmed and refueled. Should an impending enemy air attack be identified by radar, it was crucial to get the fighters into the air before it arrived. It therefore took skilled judgment to decide which aircraft to have on deck at any particular time. The great carrier battles eventually broke the back of the Japanese Navy. One of the 2 major landmarks for the Americans was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. More commonly known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, it virtually destroyed Japanese naval air power. The other significant engagement was the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines in October 1944. Over a period of 4 days, the American 3rd and 5th Fleets succeeded in destroying the remainder of the Japanese carrier force. It was now that the Japanese suicide pilots made themselves felt. Japanese kamikaze, or divine wind aircraft, were to be the greatest threat to Allied shipping for the last year of the war in the Pacific. During the battle for Okinawa, from April to June 1945, nearly 2,000 Japanese suicide sorties were mounted. Some 25 Allied ships were sunk and over 250 damaged. By spring 1945, the British Pacific Fleet had joined the American fleets in the Pacific to create the largest armada of warships ever known. It consisted of over 1,300 ships. It also had a vast fleet train of support vessels, ranging from oilers to dry docks. Indeed, everything needed to maintain a fleet many thousands of miles away from its base. One advantage that the British fleet carriers had over those of the Americans was armored decks, which were better able to resist kamikaze attacks. But the threat of air power to navies had forced every warship of whatever type to be armed with an increasing number of anti-aircraft weapons. The British even went so far as to produce anti-aircraft cruisers with high-angle gun turrets, like this Dido-class vessel. Battleships, even though the aircraft carrier was superseding them, still had a part to play. They had found themselves a new role, shore bombardment. Both in the European theater and in the Pacific, their weight of fire could prove devastating in support of land operations. To give but one example, the Germans in Normandy during and after the Allied landings in June 1944 considered that the weight of naval gunfire was much more a factor for concern than the total Allied air dominance over the battle area. But naval support for ground forces extended much further than just shore bombardment. During the early part of the war, the Royal Navy found itself having to evacuate Allied forces after disastrous campaigns. The evacuations from France in 1940 and Greece and Crete in 1941 were carried out in an environment in which the Axis had air superiority and the cost in ships was high. The Japanese in the Pacific used light cruisers and destroyers extensively to keep isolated island garrisons supplied. The so-called Tokyo Express was especially successful in this during the long battle for Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in the second half of 1942. But both in Europe and the Pacific, the Second World War came to be dominated by amphibious operations, the landing of ground forces on hostile shores. Indeed, there was no theatre of war in which these did not take place. The Russians carried out a number in the Black Sea. The British mounted them on the coast of Burma. The Navy's first task in these operations was to ensure that it dominated the adjoining seas. The one exception to this was during the first amphibious landings of the war, those by the Germans in Norway in April 1940. Indeed, they lost a number of ships to the guns of the Royal Navy, but surprise enabled them to achieve their objectives. Many of the major naval actions in the Pacific were fought to ensure that the US Navy had this necessary dominance. The British experience in the Dardanelles in 1915 had caused many to believe that landings on opposed shores were not viable. Consequently, pre-war doctrine gave little priority to amphibious operations. Thus, in 1939, no nation had much in the way of landing craft, flat-bottomed to enable them to be driven up onto a beach so that the troops could land without getting their feet wet. The impetus came from Britain, with the formation of the Commandos in summer 1940, in order to carry out raiding operations against Axis-held coasts. In conjunction with this, Churchill set up the Directorate of Combined Operations. Its title emphasized the fact that amphibious warfare involved all three armed services, air, sea, and land. Through this medium, a wide range of amphibious shipping was developed. Once America entered the war, she was also able to harness a significant part of her industrial know-how to this field. Largest were the assault ships, which took troops, equipment, and supplies from the mounting base to the landing area. On arrival in the landing area, the Navy began to pound ashore in order to neutralize the defenses. The assault ships carried landing craft, and it was to these that the troops now transferred. Smaller types, like this landing craft assault, were used for raiding operations. There were ocean-going landing ships Tank, which could put tanks and guns directly ashore onto the beaches. There were also landing craft equipped with guns and rockets to add to the supporting fire as the landings took place. Once the landings had taken place, the beaches themselves needed to be properly organized, otherwise chaos could quickly ensue. The British formed the Royal Navy Beachhead Commandos for this task. The US Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, were adept at clearing beach obstacles and opening up harbors and building airfields. By 1945, the Western Allies had overcome the complexities of amphibious warfare and developed it into a fine art. The main key to success was the close coordination of land, sea, and air forces. Indeed, in no other operation of war was and is this more vital, from the planning stage through the landings themselves to the subsequent operations on the land. successful conduct of amphibious operations became the cornerstone of Allied strategy in the Second World War. As American General Douglas MacArthur later said, "The amphibious landing is the most powerful tool we have." The throttling of maritime communications was pursued by navies in the Second World War with an even greater intensity than during 1914-18. The Germans recognized, as they had done during the Great War, that the one way to bring Britain to her knees was to paralyze her trade routes. Thus, a second battle of the Atlantic was waged. It opened with the sinking of the liner Athenia on the 3rd of September 1939. Her survivors are seen here after their rescue. It did not end until after the sinking of 2 British merchant vessels off Scotland's east coast on the 7th of May 1945. It was the longest campaign of the Second World War. At the beginning, the German submarine fleet was small, with only 57 U-boats in commission and just a third of these at sea. But Hitler also believed that his major surface warships could play a significant part in attacking merchant shipping. Indeed, 2 of his battleships, the Graf Spee and the Deutschland, had sailed from Germany before the outbreak of war for this very purpose and were soon sinking ships. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, had grown complacent between the wars over the threat to trade. It believed that convoying and the invention of ASDIC, called sonar by the Americans, for detecting submarines under the water, had neutralized the U-boat threat. Convoying was instituted as soon as the war broke out, but there was a grave shortage of escort vessels, with most available engaged on other tasks, such as escorting the British Army across to France. Consequently, transatlantic convoys were restricted to vessels with a speed of 9 to 15 knots, and then their sole escort was often no more than a single-armed merchant cruiser. The U-boats were thus able to concentrate on the numerous vessels sailing on their own. By the end of 1939, the U-boats had sunk over 100 vessels, while the British had had little success in hunting them down. Their attempts to use carrier groups against the U-boats were especially disastrous, with one carrier sunk and a near miss on another in the first weeks of the war. In the meantime, Graf Spee in the South Atlantic and Deutschland in the North Atlantic were joined in November by the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. By the end of 1939, they had accounted for 15 merchant vessels. Wintry weather now reduced operations, as did the Norwegian campaign in spring 1940. Mine warfare was also used extensively by both sides from the outset of the war. It played its part in the campaign against trade, accounting for 79 Allied vessels during the first 4 months. Many fell victim to a new type, the magnetic mine. This mine was initially very difficult to sweep, except by vessels with all wooden hulls. To counter the magnetic mine, the British had to run electric coils round the hulls of their ships in order to cancel out the magnetic signature which detonated this type of mine. This was known as degaussing. The next major phase of the Battle of the Atlantic began in the summer of 1940 after the fall of France. This enabled the Germans to deploy their U-boats to the French Atlantic ports and radically reduced the time taken to deploy into the Atlantic. It meant that many more U-boats could be on patrol at any one time. This period was the beginning of what the U-boat skippers called the first happy time. The British were still desperately short of escort vessels, even though the American gift of 50 World War I four-stacker destroyers in September 1940 did help. The Germans too had deployed a squadron of giant Focke-Wulf Condors to the French Atlantic coast. These were able to guide the U-boats onto the convoys, besides accounting for a significant number of ships themselves. There was also the surface threat, with the Admiral Scheer sinking no less than 17 vessels during one cruise at the end of 1940. Early in 1941, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau disrupted the entire British convoy system. The Germans also employed commerce raiders, merchant vessels armed with obsolete 150mm guns. Most successful of these was the Penguin, shown here. She sank no less than 26 vessels, using her Arado 196 floatplane to locate her victims. Royal Navy ships searched for her in the Indian Ocean. Finally, in May 1941, the Penguin was intercepted by the cruiser Cornwall, who sank her. By this time, more escort vessels were becoming available. Basing some in Iceland and using the increasing resources of the Royal Canadian Navy enabled convoys to be given much more protection than before. Aircraft, like these American-built Lockheed Hudsons, were deployed to Iceland to provide more air cover over the Atlantic. There was also the surrender of U-110. Before she sank, the British managed to seize her Enigma cipher machine. This enabled them to read U-boat signals and hence reroute convoys. The net result of all this was that by July 1941, shipping losses had fallen to a fifth of what they had been in March. In the meantime, RAF Bomber Command was attacking the shipyards building U-boats, but without much success. Likewise, the reinforced concrete pens in which they were housed in the French ports proved to be impervious to bombing. President Roosevelt gave increasing help as 1941 wore on, even though the United States was still at peace. Unlike many Americans, he believed that sooner or later his country would get drawn into the war. In July, US Marines began to relieve the British garrison on Iceland. This meant that the US Navy could legitimately escort convoys there. Later, Roosevelt extended this by declaring that he would provide escorts for any Lend-Lease convoy across the Atlantic to as far west as level with Iceland. It was virtually inevitable that US warships would be attacked. On the 17th of October, the destroyer Kearney, seen here, was badly damaged by a U-boat. 2 weeks later, another destroyer, Reuben James, was sunk. But it was Japan, and not Germany, which forced America into the war through the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This precipitated the second happy time for Germany's U-boats. Admiral Karl Dönitz, their commander, turned his eyes on the poorly protected American eastern seaboard, especially on the tanker traffic from South America. He deployed a number of his ocean-going Type 9 boats, and in January 1942, they launched Operation Drumroll. That month alone, they sank 40 ships in these waters. Worse, on the 1st of February, the U-boats adopted a new Enigma cipher, which the British were unable to read until the end of the year. Not until April was a blackout of lights on the American eastern seaboard instituted, together with a proper convoy system. Thereafter, the U-boats moved to the Caribbean, where there were equally rich pickings to be had. Dönitz also began to deploy U-boat tankers, known as milk cows, which could keep the U-boats resupplied. This enabled him to deploy the more numerous but shorter-range Type 7s. Dönitz was convinced that his U-boats would be at their most effective if they were concentrated in what he called wolf packs. Not until 1942 did he have sufficient operational U-boats to be able to put this into wide-scale practice. The wolf packs would form a patrol line, with the boats usually positioned at 5-mile intervals. They would then sweep eastwards and westwards until they contacted a convoy. But the escorts and the convoys themselves were becoming better organized. Convoys were graded fast and slow, with only fast troop ships being allowed to travel on their own since they could outrun the U-boats. The hub of operations was Headquarters Western Approaches, based in the English port of Liverpool. The convoy commander was usually a senior retired naval officer, and before the convoy set off, he would brief the merchant captains. On both sides of the Atlantic, local escorts saw the convoys in their columns of ships out of coastal waters. The ocean escorts then took over. These usually consisted of some 6 destroyers, corvettes, and sloops. By the second half of 1942, they were becoming well drilled, able to carry out combined attacks on U-boats on a single code word. Sonar remained the main means of detecting a U-boat underwater, but escorts were now beginning to be equipped with radar to locate a surfaced U-boat. High-frequency direction finding, or HUF-DUF, enabled them to pinpoint a U-boat's position from its radio transmissions. In the early part of the war, escorts could only fire depth charges over the stern, which meant that they first had to pass over the U-boat. This gave the U-boat more time to take evasive action. By mid-1942, however, anti-submarine attacks could be made over the sides and bow of the escort, which increased the chances of a kill. But it was recognized by now that air cover was essential to ensure the safety of a convoy. Even with new maritime patrol aircraft, like the resilient American-designed PBY-1, called the Catalina by the British and Canso by the Canadians, There was still an area of the North Atlantic which was not under land-based aircraft coverage. This was known as the Black Gap. To overcome it, the British initially introduced catapult-armed merchantmen, known as cam ships. These carried a single hurricane, which could be launched from the deck, but on return this had to ditch alongside its parent vessel. Later, escort carriers, smaller than the fleet carrier, were built in large numbers by both the Americans and the British. It was not, however, until 1943 that the Black Gap was closed, when very long-range B-24 Liberators were deployed. But sinkings were continuing to outstrip the build of new merchant vessels. American industrial organization came to the rescue. With shipyards on both sides of the Atlantic bursting at the seams to meet the now very varied Allied naval demands, the Americans came up with a new idea for constructing merchant vessels. They were now to be built in factories inland, in sections. These would then be taken to the coast and assembled. The first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, was launched from Baltimore Naval Dockyard as early as September 1941. Thereafter, production increased rapidly, and by the end of 1942, it was beginning to have a very real effect on the Battle of the Atlantic. The winter of 1942-43, with its Atlantic gales, helped to reduce shipping losses. So too did the fact that the British had finally cracked the U-boat Triton Enigma cipher. In January 1943, at the Allied conference held at Casablanca, it was agreed that winning the Battle of the Atlantic must be a top priority. At the same time, Dönitz, who had now taken over as Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, ordered his U-boats to concentrate just on the fully laden convoys crossing from North America to Europe. Sinkings in the North Atlantic now rose alarmingly. The real crisis came in mid-March, when no less than 37 U-boats harried 2 eastbound convoys, sinking 21 ships. A total of 540,000 tons of Allied shipping was lost during the month. Only the arrival of the spring gales put a brake on U-boat activity. In desperation, the British halted their convoys to Russia in order to provide more escort vessels for the Atlantic. Some of these were formed into support groups, which could reinforce convoys under severe attack. Once the gales abated, Dönitz deployed an increasing number of U-boats. The climax came at the beginning of May 1943, when no less than 40 U-boats attacked westbound convoy ONS-5, sinking 12 ships in 36 hours, but losing 2 of their own. But then the escorts struck back, sinking 4 more U-boats and damaging several others without loss. This sudden change in Allied fortunes in the Atlantic was to continue for the next 2 weeks. More and more U-boats failed to return to their bases. Eventually, on the 24th of May, having lost a staggering 31 U-boats so far in the month, Dönitz decided to temporarily withdraw his wolf packs from the Atlantic. It was the major turning point in the battle, but by no means the end of it. In September 1943, the U-boats returned to the Atlantic, this time equipped with a new acoustic torpedo. But the Allies were able to counter this with a drogue designed to reproduce the noise of a ship's engines and which was towed by an escort vessel. The Germans then introduced schnorkels on their U-boats, which enabled them to spend more time underwater. Finally, in mid-1944, came the new electro boat, capable of underwater speeds of up to 17 knots. But this and the even faster Walter boat, which was driven by hydrogen peroxide when submerged, appeared too late to alter the course of the campaign. The cost of the Battle of the Atlantic was high for both sides. Of the nearly 1,200 U-boats commissioned during the war, no less than 65% were lost. Yet 23 million tons of Allied shipping had been sunk, 15 million of it in the North Atlantic. The Mediterranean too saw much submarine activity during the first half of the war. Axis submarines concentrated on ravaging the tenuous British supply lines to Malta and had some notable successes. In November 1941, German U-boats accounted for the carrier Ark Royal. 12 days later, U-331 sank the battleship Barham. In turn, British submarines harried the Axis sea communications to North Africa. By the autumn of 1942, they had, with the help of aircraft, almost severed fuel supplies to Rommel's army and forced him onto the defensive. In the Pacific, the submarine also played a key role. The Japanese entered the war with 64 boats, more than the Germans had in 1939. But they only built a further 126 during the war. They also lost almost 70% of their total build and sank less than 1 million tons of Allied shipping. The main reason for this poor performance was that the Japanese placed priority on attacking warships rather than defenseless merchant and supply vessels. They also tended to employ their submarines in rigid groups and allowed their skippers very little latitude or initiative. Many Japanese submarines were also lost in carrying out resupply missions to isolated garrisons. Thus, as many as 20 at a time were used to keep their forces supplied during the long battle for Guadalcanal, and most of these fell victim to American warships. But if the Japanese submarine fleet failed to make a significant contribution to the war effort, the American submarines most certainly did. Recognizing that Japan's war industry was totally reliant on the import of raw materials, the US Navy resolved to concentrate submarine operations on attacking Japanese merchant shipping. There were, however, serious problems with malfunctioning torpedoes, which were not overcome until 1943. Even so, during 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant vessels. Two years later, with the underwater fleet much expanded and able to operate from forward bases in the Pacific, the American submarines sank a massive total of 600 ships and then began to run out of targets. This reduced Japanese imports by 40% and so strangled oil supplies that the Japanese main fleet had to base itself in the Dutch East Indies rather than home waters in order to ensure that it continued to receive fuel. Japanese war production as a whole was halved by spring 1945, and oil shortages had crippled the transportation system. In contrast, because of the American success, the US submarine production program was drastically cut back in 1944. Thus, the American submarines in the Pacific succeeded where the German U-boats in the Atlantic had failed.